We do not demand for our own people any more than the basic human rights which we would extend to every nation, people, and tribe on this planet. The right to preserve their own territory, traditions, and ethnic identity. The right to preserve, in other words, the things which, by marking their differences from the mass of humanity, make them human and turn their society from an ant heap into a community. Nick Griffin, British National Party chairman from 1999 to 2014. A longtime veteran of local, national, and transnational politics, Mr. Griffin joins us to talk about the challenges facing European people as a whole and practical implications for nationalists living under the broader sweep of an Anglo-Zionist empire.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The military-industrial complex.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time,
На полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
So hello and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. Today we are joined by a very special guest, Mr. Nick Griffin. Say hello, please.
Hello there. Pleased to be with you.
Yeah, and likewise. And I'm also joined by my co-hosts, Nick.
Hey.
Hank.
Hey, everyone.
And last but not least, Hans.
Hi, guys.
So, Mr. Griffin, you have a very impressive background in the British national scene, trying to get people at least woken up to some of the dangers threatening your country. But it's never easy, is it? And we can sympathize quite a bit over in America and probably in most of the West in terms of how the media portrays people in the nationalist movement. I was just wondering if you had any sort of advice to people who are looking at the situation now and wondering if they should pursue mainstream politics or maybe go into something that's more anonymous like what we do. We don't actually use our real names. What do you think the situation and the strategy is now that is maybe similar to when you were starting out, or what has changed?
Well, are you asking me to speak about Britain, the USA, or Europe? Because it is a different answer in a way.
Well, let's start with your home country, the UK.
Okay. Well, the long and the short of Britain is that there's no point doing politics anymore. It's too late for politics. There's no possible solution to the mess that's been imposed on Britain, and the chance of political change really was up about 10 years ago, 5 years ago perhaps. But anyone now saying we can change things through politics is either a fool or they're simply a crook wanting people's membership money for some little party, because it's too late for politics.
Do you think the party system is basically controlled by just globalist forces or money powers or things like that just really disconnect them from the people?
Well, the party political system is heavily disconnected from the people. That wouldn't matter if there was a chance of reversing everything. But the fact is that in Britain and most of Western Europe as well, the establishments have understood, they've learned how to deal with real radical nationalist challenges. A lot of the populist stuff is essentially safety valve politics. It certainly isn't going to bring the answers forward. The situation is so terrible, from demographically and politically, culturally, and socially, that to turn it around would require such pain for the population as a whole that there's no possibility of being able to persuade them to do it, and there's no possibility of a government sneaking into power and then doing it without being overthrown. The other thing is, you talk about the people, and think of people. People still think about the division between the state, the elite, the establishment, call them what you will, and the people. But in Britain and Western Europe, very large numbers of the young people, especially, particularly the young men who are the ones who make or stop revolutions, they're not our people anymore. The demographics have shifted so much. It's not just a matter of them coming in and them breeding. it's 3 generations of our people not having enough children, with the result that our population, the indigenous European population, is old and it's about to start shrinking catastrophically through natural demographic wastage, while the immigrant and immigrant descended population just explodes. And there's no point saying, when I say there's no political road, people might say, oh, he's saying we'll have a civil war, we'll win that. No, I'm definitely not, because again, civil wars are won by young men who want to fight and are willing to fight. Most of our young men aren't, and most of their young men are. So there's no nice, comfortable solution for anywhere in Western Europe, and there's certainly no political solution.
Yeah, I have a very startling statistic to support what you just said. According to just general census data, the total fertility rate in places like Germany is 1.4. So that's 1.4 babies per woman, and it needs to be 2.1 to be a replacement. The total fertility rate in Germany for new immigrants is 1.9. In Europe overall for Muslims, it's 2.6. So clearly there is the demographic trend is getting worse over time if you let that trend continue.
Yeah, can I say it's far worse than those statistics suggest, because the overall rate of 1.4 includes huge numbers of immigrants and immigrant families who've been there 1, 2, 3 generations. Right. So when you look at the real birth rate of indigenous white Europeans, I'd be very surprised if overall it was more than 0.9. So we're looking, even if it wasn't for even if immigration wasn't there, we're looking at a catastrophic civilizational and economic collapse. You can begin to see it happening in South Korea, begin to see it happening in Japan, where there's a huge ring around Tokyo, for instance, where properties that used to be hugely expensive now literally cannot be given away. And that's what happens when there's basically people stop having kids and the baby boomer generation starts dying off.
What do you think we should do? I mean, that's the big question, but and that may depend on where you are in the world. Do you want to speak about Europe more broadly, or would you like to talk about the UK or America?
Well, they are connected. Basically, what I'm saying that people need to do now is, more than anything, have children. That's the thing that counts. And there's all sorts of reasons for not having any or only having 1 or 2. There's all sorts of good reasons. There's all sorts of excuses. But in the end, demographics is destiny. And the thing that all our people need to do, and I'm talking specifically about racially aware nationalists, is if they can still have children, to have children. If they're too old, they can encourage other people in their families to have children. Nationalist political parties, they can't go away, but they need to stop thinking about the fantasy of winning power through the ballot box and start thinking long term about helping families to have children, building communities around those families and those children, and also very, very importantly, homeschooling and educating those children properly, because there's no point having kids and leaving them to the liberals and to the state education system, because it destroys most of them. Right. So it's a long-term thing. Now, people might say, some people have said, oh, it's, Nick's into black pills these days. No, I'm not. I've no doubt whatsoever that Europe will be taken back by the Europeans. No doubt at all. It's inevitable, but it's going to take 100 years.
You other guys have anything you'd like to say? I've been talking the whole time.
Yeah, I'll go. Mr. Griffin, what do you think about the collapse of the Liberal Democratic Party in Britain? From an outsider's perspective, they've been on a decline since the 80s, and they're sort of irrelevant now, and they're just there to try and make or break coalitions in Parliament, but they seem relatively useless. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes. Well, I was first aware of politics and involved in politics in the early 1970s. And in those times, it was purely the Liberal Party, but it was the third force, supposedly. But it was regularly down to 4 or 5 members of Parliament out of 650. And it was pretty irrelevant then. And it comes and goes, this party, basically when the Conservative Party is particularly unpopular, or if the Labour Party takes a lurch to the left, then it opens up a bit of a gap in the British shadowboxing system, political system. And it is a shadow play. And then the Liberal Democrats come up. But really, it makes no difference. If they're weak, it's because there's a liberal wing of the Conservative Party and a big liberal capitalist wing of the Labour Party. So there's no space. But in any case, in British politics, as really in politics all over the developed world, and certainly the white world, there's a certain part of the spectrum which political parties are allowed to operate on, and issues they're allowed to talk about and be respectable and accepted by the media. Of course, the mass media are the power brokers in all of this. And if you step to the right of that spectrum or to the left of that spectrum, then you get hammered or you simply get ignored and you're shut out of mainstream politics. So really, Tory, Liberal, Labour doesn't make a blind bit of difference.
Mr. Griffin, most of our listeners are American. We obviously have listeners elsewhere in the Anglosphere and elsewhere in the European world. But I was wondering if you could speak to the challenges of being a dissident in occupied Britain compared with the United States.
Yeah, well, of course, you've got the First and the Second Amendments, which we do not have. So to give you an idea, I got involved in politics when I was 15, in 1974. I've been 3 times dragged into court, facing prison sentence of up to 7 years for telling the truth, and the law specifically says that the truth is no defence. So at no point in any of my 3 trials has the prosecution tried to say that what I'm saying isn't true. They've merely said that I shouldn't say it. In one case, in my last ROSAC case, when I've been talking about the grooming gangs, 10 years before the establishment and the media finally caught up with the rape of up to 1 million young British girls, and some Sikhs and West Indians as well, actually, by Muslim gangs. So I spoke about that, and I was hauled into court for it. It's a very hard thing. There's lots of bravado. It's easy to talk, I'll stand up and I'll do this. But when you're there in the dock and you see your family there, and your children don't know if their dad's going to come home or if he's going to be in prison for they don't know how long, it's a hard-wearing thing. And it's designed, of course, it's not just aimed at you as the person in the dock. You're there being pilloried as a way of making all the others shut up. And we live in Britain in an extraordinarily totalitarian regime, and people think of it as being, it's the far left. This is the Conservative Party, the government of the day, has declared it, or in the process of declaring it, a hate crime to say that anything which is, in their eyes, anti-homosexual, in other words, to put across the simple fact that a marriage of a man and a woman is statistically and scientifically the best and the safest and the happiest place for children to grow up. And on average, it gives them the best chance in life. To say that is going to be made a hate crime by a Conservative government.
Yeah, we have similar issues over here, but it's not enshrined in law yet, thankfully. I actually wanted to read a quote from someone discussing some of the similarities and differences between the challenges we face in America and Europe. This comes from a European Civil War, and this comment was by Michael Gladius. Europe's advantages lie in their superior organization and networking. They can match the left's own prowess and beat them at their own game. Their physical access to resources is somewhat harder, but there are ways to overcome this. America's advantages are primarily physical. We're the 3rd largest nation, both in square mileage and population, therefore harder to control by conventional means. We have legally enshrined access to weapons and supplies, which while also being legally protected by free speech. Americans, however, organize with only great difficulty, and coordination is minimal at best. There's no American equivalent to generation identity, much less the latter's success rate. What America needs is a sister organization to the Suidlanders, maybe call it the Westlanders in South Africa, which fills in the need for organizations and rehearsals among the Boers and is a legally recognized entity. Anybody have any thoughts or comments on that?
Well, I think that is a valid comparison. Like, everything that I've seen indicates that pretty much every European country, including the United Kingdom, has far stronger kind of baseline civil society in terms of kind of your likelihood as an individual to be involved in just any organization, from a football association to, in areas that still are religious, your local religious organizations. The United States seems to be far more atomized, I think partially by virtue of our geography and by virtue of the fact that it's still a very young country. But I'd be curious to hear Mr. Griffin's impression on whether that's actually the case.
Yeah, I think so. I think it goes back to, and we have the same problem in Britain compared to other parts of Europe. There's, although the population of America, or even the white population, is of course very mixed, it's still, in terms of the ethos, there's this Anglo-Saxon individualism. And so that is a problem. Having said which, I think a lot of nationalists, American nationalists, looking at Europe, look at it with rose-tinted spectacles, and think that many of these populist parties are actually going to make a difference, or are capable of making a difference, or are far bigger than they are. And most of them now are heavily reliant, in fact, on the Zionist alternative media, which is enormous. And they're really not proper nationalist parties at all. So don't look with rose-tinted spectacles at Europe. And looking at America, I think really there's a nationalist bubble. If you think outside that bubble, the number of Americans who are involved with churches. Now, some of them are rather wacky evangelical type things and are arguably heretical in terms of Christianity. But in terms of community support, the number of people going to church, the youngsters involved, it's still a very, very powerful thing. Far more powerful than all the very loud and noisy, neo-Nazi crackpot groups out there. Far more powerful indeed. And I think that even probably, I don't know how many Americans go shooting on a Sunday after church, or how many Americans go shooting each weekend. But it's an enormous reservoir, not just of actual physical force, if push came to shove, but potentially of organisation and like-minded people. But there is definitely, what one of your commentators said there, or the quote read out, from what I've seen. I've been to the USA a number of times, been in touch with many, many Americans over decades, and frankly, it's amazing, because to do business with Americans is wonderful. You actually get things done. It's great. When it comes to political organisation, oh dear, there's something seriously wrong.
Well, it's almost like our political religion is business. I mean, there's very little free discussion in the workplace, for example, about politics, other than sort of what the media might sort of frame as what's politically acceptable. And it's just such a huge country. I mean, people are used to traveling from coast to coast for business constantly, but their local community is sort of secondary to that, because I think people move locations so much. So I think that's part of the reason. It's just the geography of the place is so vast that I think the political organization that probably comes from a more local community is just lacking. And I think the commenter is right that we just don't have it in us to organize in that sense, because we're not allowed to, officially. And if you had to do it unofficially, you end up doing things like what we're doing, which is on the internet, and we barely see each other. So it's a challenge. And if the internet, as it's sort of increasingly becoming more censored, does not allow us to do this organization as we're doing now, we're going to have a big problem in America. And I think we should mention, also, by the way, the sound effects in the background that Mr. Griffin has are from Gab. So, Mr. Griffin, would you like to tell us why Gab is a good place?
Yes, indeed. It's got the potential to be a good place. It's a fun place to be right now, actually. I think it's, the little croaky frog noise when someone interacts with something you posted, given that a lot of people are on social media as a way of having friendship and psychological relationships in a very atomized world, then that little frog croaking is really good, really clever, really effective system, well designed. And of course, it's a clone really of Twitter, except that in 99.999 cases, Gab is committed to free speech, whereas Twitter, as we know, is basically committed to censorship with a smiley face. So Gab is very important, not for what it is now in terms of size, think it's about 700,000 users total. That includes some dropouts. But what it can become, if the Twitter ratchet is screwed down, that much more, in particular, if, for instance, if they threw off Donald J. Trump, as opposed to just removing the fact that he's president of the United States, if they threw him off and he decided to use Gab, then immediately there'd be millions of Americans would follow suit. So it's got the potential, if it can maintain its platforms and so on, and its funding operations, which of course the liberal big tech are trying to clamp down on. And on this, I must say that it was very heartening to see Trump, hear him talking about this, to show he understands the problem. He clearly understands that, in fact, he's a major target of it. It's less reassuring to see that 3 weeks later he comes back and talks about it again. 2 weeks later he comes back and says action's going to be taken, but no action is taken. And in particular, I fear that even when action is taken, if it's just about the free speech, then that's very valid and it's very important. But if it misses the point that there's no value having freedom of speech unless you also have the economic capability to speak loudly, then so if Trump and whoever's with him on this doesn't act across the board, not just to deal with the free speech issue, but to deal with the whole question of clamping down on small c conservative or right-wing nationalist, whatever you want to call them, voices and the machinery. So things like PayPal have got to be forced to open up. All the platforms. In Britain, we can't even get a bank account. And I know that's more and more common in more and more parts of the world. Even not as a nationalist organisation, as an individual, I cannot open up a bank account anywhere in Britain. I've been thrown out of every single bank, not for any wrongdoing, just because of who I am and what they think that means. And Trump has got an amazing potential to simply enforce the First Amendment and simply enforce antitrust laws and to open up and guarantee a genuine freedom of speech and organisation and fundraising for everyone, not just in America, but in fact, virtually everyone over the whole world. It's a remarkable opportunity, but I fear he's likely to fluff it because it's really too complex.
Mr. Griffin, you mentioned the Zionist elements in nationalist politics earlier, and I wanted to ask you, it seems to me that the UK is almost ground zero for, you might say, counter-jihadism, where you have, the various British political figures in any kind of nationalist position that they take is quickly followed by a effusive support for the Zionist state. Yeah. And you have in America, the American media is kind of vicariously living that counter jihad through England. You have things like Breitbart London, and you also have Americans going over and doing sort of anti-Islamic stunts. And I wonder about that. And I also wonder whether you see the counter jihad Zionist nationalist elements growing as things get worse with respect to the behavior of the new Britons.
Yeah, well, certainly the counter jihad people, that they're pushing an open door in Britain, partly because ever since 2001, large sections of the tabloid press, the Mail, the Sun, the Express, the Star, have been relentlessly promoting what the left would call Islamophobia, or what you can call Islamo-realism, but actually goes beyond that, because they're not just talking about and trying to wind people up about the problems caused by mass immigration and radicalized Islamic populations in Britain. A lot of them don't really care about that. What they want us to do is to go and fight Iran on behalf of Israel. So therefore they attack all Muslims, including the Shia, who actually are our natural allies. And it is a fact that probably still 50% of Sunni Muslims in Britain are actually basically moderate, decent people. And the counter-jihad narrative that they all follow the Quran, therefore they all take it literally, simply isn't true, because over centuries, at different times when it's come into contact with more civilized peoples, such as the Syrians and the Iranians, Islam has reformed itself, moderated, and they do interpret things. Therefore, they say, oh, these verses in the Quran, they're very harsh, but they're from a different era. We don't do that now. The problem is that the the Saudi Arabians are Wahhabis who obviously stick to the letter of the Quran and the very early days. And they're the ones who are funding virtually all the mosques in Britain, virtually all the Islamic education and so on. Therefore, every generation that goes by of young new Muslims in Britain and most of the West, they're more and more radicalized. They are more and more bad neighbors to everybody else. So with their habits and attitudes and actions and growing numbers, it's going to get worse. And then on the other side, the counter-jihad people are in some ways voicing legitimate concerns, such as over-grooming and so on. And in some ways, they're exploiting them, again, for the ends of their paymasters. So I see it growing. You know, Tommy Robinson, he's a very brave young man. He's very capable, but he's completely a wholly owned, was from the very beginning with the English Defence League. It was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Project for the New American Century people and of Horowitz and Daniel Pipes and the rest of them. And the thing now is exactly the same. Where some of the generation identity types, Lauren Southern and so on, who come over to Britain, obviously been banned, where they sit in all this, I'm not quite sure. They're not as, I mean, certainly the work that Lauren Southern has done in South Africa, I think, has been splendid. And the hardcore Zionists, as we've seen recently, are in the way they attacked Trump hysterically, every single one of them, after his comments about the situation in South Africa. They certainly are not, as you know, in the least bit interested about the survival of the Boers, the Brits, the Americans, or anybody else. In fact, they're thoroughly hostile. So there's the counter-jihad people, and then there's the generation identity and the Lauren Southerns who are playing footsie with them. I don't know really how close they are, but it's very, very, in a way it's unhealthy, in a way it's good. I can summarize it like this, then I'll let one or two of you speak, give you some time, I'm not hogging it here, that going back anything longer than 15 years ago, and the Zionist elite had only one aim anytime they looked at or touched any form of European nationalism, and that was to stifle it and destroy it. In the last few years, they've completely switched, and instead of trying to stifle and destroy, they're simply trying to co-opt and use. At one level, it's a very bad thing, but on the other hand, they can't co-opt something and use something effectively without building it. And I'm already seeing it's very, very noticeable that people who 2 or 3 years ago were simply involved with Tommy Robinson, the English Defence League, or the things they're doing now, they're self-radicalizing themselves on the internet, they're being radicalized by each other, and they're moving beyond that, and they're seeing the bigger picture. And so in building the thing up in order to control it, they do run the risk of creating a huge new wave of people who understand what's going on, who listen to programs like this, and are no longer willing to play their game.
Well, there's no doubt that hatred can start a prairie fire. I mean, hatred is a powerful emotion, and it's not something easily controlled once you add fuel to it. That being said, it seems that it might be coinciding with the anticipated fatigue of participation in Washington's Zionist wars. I mean, it gives an ongoing justification, as well as the fact it seems that the British police state has been greatly expanded by the existence of these the terrorist attacks by New Britons.
Yeah, they've been seized upon. They always say, people like the Sweden Democrats are present. They've exploited terrorism and isolated cases of rape by immigrants in Sweden and so on, and now they're going to have a huge amount of support, blah, blah, blah. And it's wrong for these extremists, these white extremists, which of course the Swedish Democrats aren't, incidentally. It's wrong for these white extremists to exploit terrorist tragedies, but the minute there's a terrorist tragedy, the liberal elite exploit it ruthlessly by, as you say, turning another notch in the police state, as is the case with the things done by the lunatic cranks and plants in groups like National Action on the other side, give them an even bigger excuse to clamp down, just as the chaos around Charlottesville was the thing which, from last August, really gave the push for the liberal liberals on the social media to clamp down. So anything that happens like that, in particular in Britain or elsewhere in Western Europe, attacks by the new Europeans, in one way it wakes more people up, but on the other hand, as you say, it gives the perfect excuse for even more rigorous clampdowns on freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of action.
I'm curious, do you have a sense for how aware people are in the UK, at least, of the concept of controlled opposition? I have a conversation with a few people from the UK about this, and it seems like the sort of Tommy Robinson types, who I agree, are brave, but there's a lot of suspicion about who's backing them, seem to be a little bit of a misdirection from certain things. And you've mentioned the national action. There seem to be a lot of parties these days that are taking that nationalist flavor, but when you talk to people who are longtime nationalists, they'll tell you that they're actually not as principled as they'd like them to be, and they may be sort of a trap. Do people even think this way, like we're talking about now, or is this something that most people don't even think about? And the other question I had was, and it's sort of related, I've heard this, in that in Europe, which surprises me coming from America because it's sort of the opposite, you're allowed to criticize Jewish power, but not Muslims. And in America, it's basically the opposite. You can criticize Muslims, but not Jewish power. So those two things, like controlled opposition, maybe like the Zionists, for example, and then what is that dichotomy between the sort of Muslim and Zionist forces in both of our lands?
Well, first of all, I'll just pick up on one thing you said as a sort of point of information. You said there's sort of suspicion about Tommy Robinson and what he's really about. No, it's not suspicion. It's a cast iron series of facts, which if any of your listeners, either Brits or Americans with a particular interest in Britain or this whole question of Zionist manipulation of nationalism nowadays, look up my document, What Lies Behind the English Defence League, which you'll find after a little bit of hunting around on the internet as a PDF. And I did that, 5-6 years ago now, and actually laid out absolutely, fully referenced all the actual hardcore facts, which show, as I said, it was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Zionist stroke military and industrial complex in the USA. And the same people funded that are still funding Tommy and Co. today. And they've got an immense outreach operation. They're throwing vast amounts of money at every nationalist group in Europe, basically, if they're prepared to play ball with them. If they're not, you're casting them out of darkness. But if you are, they're funding things. So there's not a suspicion, it's a fact. Now, as for the question of this controlled opposition, do people realize this? I think most hardcore nationalists, experienced nationalists, do. But we're completely irrelevant in this. The vast majority of the public don't have the faintest idea that basically there's Tommy Robinson is part of it on the street side, the UKIP is part of it on the politics side, that the opposition, as I said, until recently, the Zionists simply wanted to destroy nationalism. Now they're determined to harness it for their ends. And also because I think that they're aware that what they've done with mass immigration, especially of increasingly radicalized Muslims, is going to create a backlash. And in that backlash, there's a danger to them, so it needs controlling, and there's a profit to be made. So you put all those things together and they're piling into this now. But no, the public don't have the faintest idea. A few people understand, you'll find that some people understand the concept of controlled opposition, but they can't see it when it's in front of them.
Yeah.
Then as to the points, you can criticize Muslim power but not Jewish power, it's vice versa in Europe. No, that simply isn't the case. It's far more dangerous still to talk about Jewish power, even if you are talking specifically, say, about the Likud regime and the people who work for them in their volunteer groups all over the West, specifically political. That's extraordinarily dangerous. It destroys careers. It's far more dangerous than criticizing Muslims. And that's the case in Britain. It's the case all over Western Europe. Some people do it. If you're careful about how you word it, you can still do it. but you certainly don't do it to any kind of audience. Whereas you can get up and spout about Muslims, especially if you steer clear of the certain aspects of it. If you connect the problem of any problem of immigration and sex, rape, etc., then you're on very dodgy ground. They're desperate to stop that being talked about. But similarly, you talk about Jewish power, money, and corruption in politics or the mass media, and they don't like that one little bit.
How about George Soros? He's used as sort of the boogeyman, and it seems now Europe and America. We recently had this Supreme Court justice hearing, and there was a actual photographic evidence of a Soros-backed organization funding one of the protesters. And then Alex Jones always goes off on him, but he's also sort of very close to the Jewish powers in the United States. And in Europe, they, in Hungary, obviously, they had that huge poster of, get Soros out. In Russia, he's wanted, basically. He'll be imprisoned if he goes there. I'm wondering what's going to happen when he dies. I mean, and it's like he's allowed, and he's obviously Jewish, but he's allowed to be criticized. But I'm wondering if that's like almost like they're letting that sort of that scapegoat, that sort of very Jewish concept apply to him. I'm wondering if that's...
Well, according to the Jewish Daily Forward, George Soros is an anti-Semitic dog whistle.
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors raised there. The counter-jihad people, whether it's, say, the Gates of Vienna, and websites like that, that hideous witch from New York whose name has escaped me for a moment.
Pamela Geller.
Pamela Geller, that's the one. Yes, yes, indeed.
I like there's consensus on the identity of the
we all knew exactly who you were talking about immediately.
Got which one. So they're all very anti-Soros because, of course, he's to a degree pro-Palestine or some kind of two-state solution. Whether that's genuine or whether it's again a big controlled opposition, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. But certainly they're very anti-Soros. You can get away with talking about him. He's a sort of pantomime villain, and I think there's a reason for that. That if you look, he's most of what he's been doing for years in Europe certainly has been done in conjunction with the National Endowment for Democracy. Now,
which was CIA backed.
Exactly, it's CIA backed, and I think one of you mentioned the boogeyman idea. I think the Soros is very convenient. He goes out and does these things, and they know that it's such a network; it's going to be noted. And then the radical right, especially, look at it, see him, and they're screaming "Soros Jew, Soros Jew," which is, of course, extremely politically incorrect. It ties in with all the psychological training about the horrors of Auschwitz and all the rest. It means you can't talk about these things, and it disguises the fact that actually this isn't really George Soros importing a civil war into Europe. This is the CIA importing a civil war into Europe, which they can set up at any time, just as they did in the former Yugoslavia, and for the very clear geopolitical reason that if Europe switches, especially as it's tending to do under the extremely erratic American leadership under Trump and so on, that if Europe switches towards an alignment which will make sense economically and strategically for us with Russia and China, then the American deep state can simply pull the plug and convert France, Germany, Britain, Sweden, etc., into basically civil war zones anytime they like. And having George Soros as the fall guy for that, I think, is very convenient for the American deep state.
Yeah, I think he functions to some extent as a brand name. Like, he's only literally one person, and he's very old. Yes. So the question you should be asking is not what are his priorities, but what are the priorities of all of the various people 2 or 3 levels down from him in the org chart? What are their affiliations? And a lot of them are clearly deep state affiliates of various kinds.
Yeah. And that's what happens. He's very old when he dies. Well, one of his sons, he's already groomed and in position to carry on doing exactly what he does. So
it's Alexander, correct?
Yeah, Alexander, that's it. So there'll be another very poisonous, dangerous in his own right boogeyman running around, and while everyone's watching him, which he needs watching and needs exposing, but while they're doing that, they'll be missing the big point that, as I say, Europe is being set up so it can be ripped apart at any time, basically so the Russians and Chinese can't build their railroad from the Chinese coast to Lisbon.
Speaking of Jewish gerontocrats, Henry Kissinger was ranked by a European think tank as the #1 deep state actor in the world in terms of his membership in all the sort of NGOs involved in foreign policy. He's also extremely old, and I'm wondering if you see anybody on the horizon that might be his sort of successor, Mr. Griffin.
No, and interestingly, in his very recent times, he actually appears to be going off message, and is increasingly really not at one with the deep state, the Zionist elite, the American military-industrial complex. Call it what you will, or them what you will. And he's basically recently said or implied that probably some kind of rapprochement with Russia is a good idea. Certainly seems a better idea to me than World War III. So it's rather odd. But no, as for a replacement for Kissinger as the real obvious figurehead bigwig, I can't think of one. That doesn't mean there's not one there. It's just that I don't have a television and I don't buy newspapers. I do look at them online. But of course, most of the quality newspapers, you have to pay to look at them online. I won't give the swine a penny. So perhaps I'm somewhat out of the loop. I don't. I expect, in any case, don't worry. When they need one, they'll find one.
Right. I was going to ask, do they still charge you the BBC tax? Is that something that still happens?
They do indeed. Yeah, it's the single biggest reason for women being in prison in Britain is women who quite often, because poor single mums and so on literally couldn't afford it, they haven't paid their BBC tax. So I've not paid mine for many years. Simply by saying, I'm not going to pay you, and if you want to take me to court, do, because I believe that the European Convention on Human Rights, which guarantees me free access to information, means that your license fee is actually illegal, and I'll see you in court if you want. So they never came for me on that one, and now I don't pay a TV license fee just because I don't have a TV. So there we go. But sometimes it leaves me out of the loop of the things that they think I should know.
What did you think of your time as an MEP in Europe?
What did I think of it? It was very, very interesting. You become aware very quickly that you're a very important person, and you realize very, very quickly that they make you think you're an important person, so you don't realize you're actually a totally powerless fig leaf, because all the power, in fact, comes out of the Commission, who are appointed by local governments, bureaucrats from the political elite, and the parliamentarians cannot even initiate legislation. That all comes from the Commission, and the parliamentarians can only rubber stamp it or send it back. They can't even change it in any meaningful way. So it's a complete farce. This matters to Americans. This matters to Americans in a big way, because coming back for a moment to what we were talking about the liberal big tech censorship, part of that stems from the fact that Facebook, Google, all the rest of them have been pushed very hard by Brussels, by Europe, by the European beast, to clamp down on freedom of speech. And whereas you've got a First Amendment, increasingly on where it counts, in the public square that counts, i.e. social media, your rights or lack of rights as Americans are not being determined by the First Amendment, not even by Congress. They are being determined by the bureaucrats and their politician rubber stamps in Brussels. And that should worry Americans, and it should worry them, because I've been there and I saw an immense socialist totalitarianism, intolerance of anything which doesn't fit their worldview, vast amounts of waste and vast amounts of corruption.
What do you think about Brexit and what's been going on for the past 2 years and it not happening? Similar to our wall, by the way, in America. And
yes,
I think it has. There's some similar factors, causing that thing to not occur as the people sort of mandated.
Yeah. Well, I was working with a small group of people, but very effective, in the run-up to Brexit. Again, using social media, we had immense. It's all been crushed at the moment, but we had immense power and reach in Facebook. We were reaching 17 million Brits each week, i.e., we were reaching a number of Brits, several times a week, with very effective memes and propaganda and short videos about Brexit, and we helped make it happen. And certainly social media made it happen. It wouldn't have done otherwise. So it was completely unexpected for the elite. They had a referendum which they were convinced they were going to win. There was a degree of shadow boxing even in that. Quite remarkably, it was on the BBC, and it's if it was recorded or if it was on YouTube, it's gone down the memory hole. But I actually saw it at the time because I wasn't at home on referendum night. So I was watching it, and just as the BBC called the win for Brexit in the wee small hours, they phoned the official Brexit headquarters. We telephoned them and said, we want to speak to someone because we're calling it as a win for Brexit. And I'll give you word for word. Apologies for the Anglo-Saxon language, but it is word for word. It came out on the BBC late at night. The response from the spokesman in the official Brexit headquarters, when told we're definitely leaving, was, "Oh fuck, how did that happen?" Now, there you go. The whole thing basically was set up. It was supposed to be a referendum, which was supposed to give the answer that yes, we want to stay in, and that would have then been it. But because of social media, actually, the ordinary public did stir and did something quite remarkable, as was the case with the Trump victory. It's very, very similar and clearly connected. And whatever happens afterwards, however much Trump is lent on by the son-in-law, by the advisors, by the deep state, all these different things, and with the fact is that for a brief moment that was a popular victory, as was Brexit. So the estate never wanted it, they never expected to have to give it, and they're still doing everything they can to make sure that we either don't get Brexit or we get a Brexit which is effectively meaningless. Now the European Union has formed for this. The Irish voted against Greater Union and were made to vote again. The French voted against the Nice Treaty and Greater Union and were made to vote again.
Right.
The Danes voted the wrong way and were made to vote again. So given that it's, as it's said, that the best predictor of future behaviour is past behaviour, it would be very bizarre if the British elite, which is grotesquely Europhile, if the British elite didn't go along down the same road. I think there's a possibility that sections of the European elite are in fact rather sick of having Britain around. It's a bit of a nuisance, and they'd actually be quite happy to see us go. So I'm not sure there. Then there's the fact that behind it all, again, it comes back to America and the deep state. Until 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the CIA was pushing relentlessly. It was really the big funder and the biggest set of operators behind the drive to build a united Europe in the European Union, because of course they saw it as a counterbalance on Europe to the Soviet bloc. After 1989, the American deep state seems to have gone agnostic for about 10 years. Didn't really seem to bother what happened in the European Union, leave it as it was. The thing that changed that was the German industrial complex was increasingly cozying up to Russia. And that's a match made in economic heaven, basically, in terms of Germany's industry and inventiveness, Russia's space, raw materials, and the extra market, and then in turn the connection through to China. So when Germany really started becoming obviously, in fact, the dominating force within Europe, you went from having a Europe which was balanced between France and Germany and Britain to a Europe which was dominated by a Germany which was increasingly looking eastwards in a friendly way. And at that point, the American deep state, or at least a section of it, because obviously Obama, for instance, intervened, so the left side of it, Obama, for one, tried to intervene to get Remain, so he stayed in. But a big section of the American deep state from about 2007 or 2008 has been wanting to cause problems for the European Union as a way of causing problems for Germany for geopolitical reasons. And I think that the sections, this is why one reason the Conservative Party is split. Part of it is following its grassroots, which wants to leave. Part of it's following the old agenda of the international elite, which is pro-European Union. And part of it's following the newer agenda of part of the American deep state to use everything possible to disrupt Europe for geopolitical reasons. So I think probably they're quite happy. Whether we get a Brexit or a half Brexit or a full Brexit, it's all trouble for Europe, and it's not an issue that'll go away one way or the other. So I don't think I've never thought we're going to get the Brexit we voted for, because the British people very clearly voted for Brexit, which was simply, this is Thursday, we want to leave on Monday morning. And we don't really care what it costs. This was partly because basically Brexit became, or rather the European Union became seen as the source of all our ills. I'm 60 next year. In my conscious lifetime, my country is completely alien to what it was. It's a foreign place to the land that I was a boy in. And everybody knows that and feels it and understands it and hates it. And Nigel Farage was licensed basically from UKIP. I know he's a great hero to sort of conservative people in the States. He's a very clever, very good politician. He's a very lucky politician, because for 12 years solid, the BBC, ultra left wing, ultra pro European Union, promoted Nigel Farage ruthlessly. It was obscene, basically, as a block to the British National Party and to Nick Griffin.
Right.
It was absolutely blatant. So they promoted him so far that in the end it blew up in their faces, as these things tend to. The law of unintended consequences works very well in politics. And they built Farage up just to stop me. And they did. As a result, they got Brexit and all sorts of chaos that resulted. But I don't think we'll get it. In a way, it doesn't matter. It's helped to disrupt the power certainties and so on of the West. Just as the election of Trump, whatever happens, whatever he does, however much he sells out or doesn't, whether they impeach him or shoot him or whatever, it's helped to disrupt the power of the empire, while the power of the other peoples in the world who are actually there for freedom and national sovereignty, namely Russia and even China, it's helped them to establish themselves that much stronger. So they're possibly now militarily unchallengeable. Certainly Russia cannot be challenged militarily by the USA now without a suicide operation, which wasn't the case a few years ago. And Brexit and Trump helped buy time for the forces working for a multipolar world in which nations are sovereign, and that would include, for Americans who might be worrying about what I'm saying now, that would include the USA, because at present the USA, well, it hasn't been a sovereign state. It's been sucked by the liberal elite, as you know, into more and more of an internationalist approach. And whatever happens to Donald Trump, he has at least held that up, perhaps long enough for other people to break it up.
What do you think, Mr. Griffin, of the prospects of a wider European unity, in the interest of Europeans rather than in the interest of the vampires? The sort of thing that Oswald Mosley advocated in his post-war writings, and say, Europe, a faith, a plan.
Yeah, I think ideologically it's splendid. It sounds absolutely great. It'll never fly with ordinary people. And in fact, to have the radicals who should be the vanguard of the people in each country trying to sell something which is utterly unsaleable to their own people is a piece of madness. Poor old Mosley, he had a wonderful orator, an incredibly brave man, very, very visionary, but his sense of timing was truly awful. He became a fascist just at the time that Mussolini told him not to become a fascist. No, before that, he left the Labour Party just at the time when, had he stayed, he could have become its leader and made a difference. Then he became a fascist just at the time he was told not to. And then after the war, just as what the British people were actually going to need, and the only thing that could one day make them revolt was something specifically nationalist, and Brexit was a nationalist vote, a nationalist revolt, he became a sort of pseudo-globalist, trying to sell something which, as I say, to ordinary Brits is absolutely unsaleable. Not because they don't hate the Germans at all, they dislike the French rather more, actually. But they don't hate other peoples, but the resistance that's building up to globalization. You see it, whether it's in Britain or in Germany with the essentially fake AfD, or the Swedish Democrats with a wholly controlled kosher bunch there. It doesn't really matter. All of them are being propelled towards, if not power, then certainly enormous influence and support by a crude nativist political revolt, which is about putting Sweden first, or France first, or Germany first, or Britain first. And those people are not in the least bit interested in another crackpot piece of political visionaryism, just by a different bunch of political crackpots, where we're all going to work together. As I say, it might be the only thing that can save us, but it's not going to sell.
Well, it's certainly hard enough to coordinate in a country as large as America, let alone transatlantic relations, and within the diversity of Europe and all the history there. I can imagine that the difficulty being very high, but I think it's a noble cause, as you say, but it's logistically challenging. I have a couple questions from a friend that I promised I'd ask. So they're a little bit out of the flow of what we're talking about, but let me just get these in while we have time. First one is there was a debate in the British Labour Party about anti-Semitism. The question is it just the influence of their Muslim clients, or is there something more significant under the surface? And then I'll hold the second question if you have a quick reply to that, Mr. Griffin.
It'd be nice to think that it's something deeper under the surface. And of course, the very early Labour Party, you go back to the 1900s, the very early Labour Party was indeed concerned about Jewish immigration into London. It was quite open when it talked about international plutocrats and people pushing for war in the run-up to the First World War. It openly talked about the Rothschilds, etc., etc. And of course, all that was buried. So it'd be lovely to think that that was bubbling up somewhere under the surface. I don't think it is. I think there is quite a possibility that the hysterical bullying and overreaction of the Zionist media and the Zionist elements, including Gentiles who are pro-Zionist, in the Labour Party and near it, will wake some individual Labour Party members up. They'll go looking and hunting, and they'll find that there's a real issue here, and what they thought was anti-Semitism is something very different. So it'll wake some people up. But within the Labour Party, sort of organisationally, no, I would say it's overwhelmingly about their Muslim client base and about the people like Corbyn and the others around him. You've got to understand that they are essentially Trotskyites. It's a Trotskyite origin. And they brought with them from the real far left, from the Socialist Workers' Party, although it was Jewish in origin itself, in every way, shape and form, ideologically and organisationally in Britain, it still had this thing that it was pro-Palestinian. And they've still got that in their DNA. They're pro-IRA, they're pro-Marxist, they're hysterically anti-Russian because they understand that Russia now is a Christian country and has overthrown its Bolshevik past. And even before that, they hated it because Stalin put an ice pick through Trotsky's head, or had it done. So, no, it's in their DNA to be pro-Palestinian and therefore to be easily accused of being anti-Semitic. But it's about getting rid of Jeremy Corbyn because Jeremy Corbyn is not controllable necessarily in foreign policy. And of course, his position towards Russia is quite healthy. He hasn't said, oh, it's all wonderful. He's just said, don't rush to war. And this is about making sure that you can't get someone by a fluke almost of politics and perhaps a general election just after a recession bites. There's a possibility of having the British Parliament, the largest party in the British Parliament, led by and therefore governing Jeremy Corbyn, who is not uncontrollable. He's strange on Israel by their standards. He's not 110%. He certainly wouldn't be in favour of the implementation of the Yinon plan, which is what they're really after. He wouldn't want to go to war on Iran, and he doesn't want to go to war with Russia. So therefore they want to get rid of him. So the whole anti-Semitism thing is blowing things and old things up completely out of proportion in order to drive him from office in the party. That's all it's about.
That makes sense. One more quick question. Speaking of parties, what are your thoughts on the British National Party these days? The same questioner was noticing that the peak seemed to be in the sort of late 90s. Would you agree with that? And what do you think of the prospects for the party today?
The peak was from really 2001 until 2013. Every single election in Britain, we were the main sub-story. And the threat of the British National Party and its influence was the main sub-story. And that was the time when we actually had some impact. That was finished. Basically, I was given a choice by a young man, clearly from some kind of Zionist intelligence agency, and we sat and talked. And he said, "You've had some incredibly good publicity recently," and we had some TV stuff, not directly about us, but going to our message, and several pieces in the Daily Star, the main paper read by people in our classic demographic. And he said, "You can have more of that, but basically you've just got to play ball with us." And I said, "Well, that's very interesting. And if this means that you people have now realised that it's not wise to sink the lifeboat, and that you're surrounded by hostile Arabs and Israel may not exist in 20 years' time, so if you've decided that you now need to help us keep the lifeboat, then all right, we'll forget about all the old past stuff and what your left in particular has done to us, and we can forget about that. And I will, if you do that, I will say that the British National Party will take a line in the Middle East, which is simply, it's nothing to do with us. So we won't attack Israel." This is what how my infamous piece actually in Question Time came about, because they didn't attack Israel. I said, "We won't attack Israel. It's irrelevant to us. But," I said, "don't expect us to be sympathetic for or enthusiastic for your wars, because we will not be." And we shook hands on that basis, and he said, "Well, I'll sort of take that back to my people." From that day onwards, all we had was a war of extermination politically against me and the BNP. And in due course, partly by outflanking us sort of politically with UKIP on one side, the soft side, and on a street level with the English Defence League, they crushed the BNP. I was axed from it because we were very successful in getting a large number of people to leave us large amounts of money in their wills. But it was all in the name of the Treasurer, basically. And I said to the Treasurer, "This has got to change because it looks very bad, and we've got to have a proper system to make sure that this is all above board." And he said, "Yes, Nick, don't worry, I'll sort it." And he did. He sorted basically lying and bribing to get rid of me, which I'm not too fussed about because, as I said at the very start of this, the time for party politics is finished. And so the British National Party is utterly irrelevant now. It's completely collapsed. It's got about 1,000 members, just desperate old hands who, want to feel they're doing something useful. But if it was involved in politics, it wouldn't be doing anything useful. It's now there simply as a way of providing a living for a little group of people. They've no intention of doing anything effective whatsoever. They don't even want new members. They just want to hold on to the old wills. So that's the end of that party, I'm afraid. And I'm not in a rush to start a new one. For one thing, it's extraordinarily difficult. But also, as I say, the only way you can have a party is to give people hope for a political solution. And that takes their eye off what they should be doing, which is to build community cohesion, to have kids and to rear them the right way. So they're the child producers and the fighters of the future. Because the future, one day, we are going to win.
All the stories have been told of kings in days of old, but there's no England now. All the wars that were won or lost somehow don't seem to matter very much anymore. All the lies we were told, all the lives of the people running round, their castles are burned. Our icy chains same as we ever were. Living on a thin line. Ooh, tell me now, what are we supposed to do? Living on a thin line. Ooh, tell me now, what are we supposed to do? Living on a thin line. Living this way, each day's a dream. What am I? What are we supposed to do? Living on a thin line. Ooh, tell me now, what are we supposed to do? Now another century nearly gone. What are we gonna leave for the earth? What we couldn't do or what we wouldn't do, it's a crime, but does it matter? Does it matter much? Does it matter much to you? Does it ever really matter? Yes, it really, really matters. Living on a thin line. Ooh, tell me now, what are we supposed to do? Living on a thin line. Ooh, tell me now, what are we supposed to do? Then another leader says, break their hearts and break some heads. Is that